June 14th, 1846. It's typically a holiday reserved for Californians as a sign of jubilation. It was the day in June 14th, 1846, that the Bear Flag revolutionaries, American settlers, came into California, and through the Bear Flag Revolution that created the California flag, essentially started the state of California. School children across California and many older Californians celebrate this day as a great day, the day California became a state. Well, I'd like you to change the tradition. I'd like you to recognize the real history of what happened on June 14th, 1846, and I'd like you to join me today in recognizing it for what it is, a day that will live in infamy for all Californians. Hi, my name is Marcus Ruiz Evans. Sorry for the negative introduction, but let's get right to it. Tomorrow's a significant day in California history and in the Cal-Exit movement, or California Independence Movement as now it's called. What they're talking about is that June 14th, 1846 was when California essentially became part of America. So let's get right into the story. 33 Americans came through Nevada, stayed around Rough and Ready Island, came through Sacramento, and then on June 14th, 1846, invaded the mansion of Governor Vallejo in Sonoma County. So in Sonoma County, 33 Americans came in and they stormed the governor's mansion and they forced him to capitulate. Now, the interesting thing about that is that these people were all here illegally. So yes, the very first Americans to California were all illegal immigrants. They came illegally. So it's quite interesting to hear Californians who love America talk about all these illegal immigrants in California when the only reason California is part of America is because of illegal immigrants, and the first Americans here were illegal. Let's get that straight. The other thing is that I want to point out that July 14th, 1846 is nothing more than a celebration of a military takeover based upon a philosophy and an ideology of white supremacy. Yes, white supremacy. No, that's not an exaggeration. That's what was going on. I'm going to prove that to you now. And then I'm going to offer a suggestion on what we can do to commemorate this holiday as Californians. So let's get into it. Now, what you need to know is that in 1845, there was a concept called that you started seeing in newspapers like the New York Morning News, the Daily Democrat. A lot of newspapers on the East Coast, 1845, started talking about this concept of manifest destiny. President Polk, the president of America from 1845 to 1849, was considered the manifest destiny chief activist. Manifest destiny essentially said that white people, well, it said Americans, but at that time the concept of Americans was strictly white people. And yes, in law. So in law at that time, the only people, citizens, were white and white males. So Mexicans, Native, Indigenous, African Americans, you weren't even humans. So not really. Anyways, it's a white supremacy ideology that said Americans that had the right to control the entire continent. And there's a picture. If you type in Manifest Destiny on Google, you'll see a picture from that time. It's literally a white angel coming over the land, and you can see Mexicans and Indians, indigenous people, running away, fleeing from white people who were coming to take the land. So, 1845, Manifest Destiny, white people have the right to take over everything. 1846, 33 Americans just randomly show up at the border in Sacramento, come in, and say, hey, we don't like being told what to do. Yeah, we came here illegally, and yeah, you have your own laws, but let's revolt and overthrow the government, even though we just got here. They did that on June 14th, 1846. Now, the interesting thing was that in June 23rd, 1846, or 11 days later, the United States Army shows up. Now, in Oregon at that time, the U.S. military had about a couple hundred troops just exploring the Oregon border for whatever reason. Nobody knows. They just happened to be in the area. It was an expeditionary force exploring under the control of Colonel Fremont. So, June 14th, American citizens just revolt and take over the government of California. There's American troops hanging around the Oregon border, just hanging out in the area for exploring. Yes, the official definition of what they were doing at that time was just exploring for the sake of exploring. And they happened to, 11 days later, come in and join that rebellion. So citizens saying we're being discriminated by the Mexican government, even though we knew what when we were getting into when we came into California, and even though we violated the law to come into here, we want to overthrow it, we're discriminated, and we want the U.S. military to come in and save us. And 11 days later, the U.S. military just happens to be in the area and they show up. And then 16 days after that, on July 9th, the Commodore of the entire Pacific Squadron in 1846, July 9th, shows up, and Commodore Stockton shows up and commands the entire army. So American citizens come in, start a revolution. 11 days later, the United States military comes in from Oregon and backs them. 16 days or about 26 days later, the United States entire Naval Pacific Squadron shows up in Monterey to buttress the Army forces. By January 13th, 1847, California had to sign a treaty capitulating. That was basically 6 months from the day, June 14th, 1846, to when the American settlers who came illegally, and the American Army and the American Navy and American Marines invaded the country, shot down every Californian who disagreed, intimidated populations, and overthrew the whole government. Ending in the Treaty of Cahuenga, Cahuenga, January 13th, 1847. The next 5 years after that, the American military installed generals. So they conquered the land in basically what today would be called a special forces operation between SEAL land operators and an aircraft carrier. You have the Pacific Fleet Squadron here. You have an Army Military Special Forces Expeditionary Unit just happened to meet up with civilians who just wanted to revolt, and they just happened to meet up with the Navy Squadron. And this is all within months of America and the American president talking about manifest destiny and let's take over every land owned by brown-skinned people. In the history books, that's all just chance, just randomly just happened to happen that way. Yeah. It seems a lot like when Adolf Hitler invaded Germany because he said Germans were being discriminated against when they weren't, and then he sent military forces to back them up. Or when Hitler staged German soldiers pretended they were Polish troops and then attacked other German soldiers so that Hitler could say German soldiers were being fired on by Poland, and that gave him the casus belli to attack Poland. That's the group America's in with this. Just pointing that out. Now, by 1852, remember they came in June 14th, 1846. By 1852, they had conquered the area, military generals, segregation was introduced. African-American children were no longer allowed to be in schools with white children. That had never happened before. In 400 years, they never had segregation. Voter suppression happened. All the Latinos, African-Americans, Asian people, and indigenous, and a few Jewish people were not allowed to vote. So that too was introduced. Voter suppression effectively had never existed before. Also, Jim Crow laws on property, banning ownership of property by Asian people, were also introduced. Additionally, they never had that. So I'm not saying that early California was perfect. The indigenous people around the missions were treated like slaves. But that's about it. That's horrible and wrong. But California at that time had African American people who weren't slaves, equal to Asian people and indigenous, and Frenchmen and Scotsmen and Jewish people and Filipinos and El Salvadorans. And they all lived in peace, roughly. Yes, there were indigenous people who were treated poorly, and around the missions, again, they were made slaves. But the majority of the indigenous were not near the missions. And there are numerous stories in LA of indigenous women and families being wealthy to the point that they called shots. I don't know any indigenous person or family in California that's powerful enough to make things happen however they want. But in early California, there were. Just saying. So June 14th, 1846, we had a diverse place with black people and Asian people and indigenous people and Latinos and European immigrants all living here. It was militarily invaded by people who came illegally, joined up with their army and navy, shot down anybody who disagreed, threatened entire populations, and effectively disenfranchised everybody who was not Caucasian. That's the American history. Now, what you also need to know is that from 1836 to 1846, California was an independent nation. Kevin Starr is the best historian in California. He's passed away, but he said straight up in his book, California no longer took orders from Mexico. 1836 to 1846, they no longer took orders from Mexico. Kevin Starr. If you want to make a fool out of yourself, go ahead and say Kevin Starr don't know what he's talking about. That man is the authority on California history. For 10 years before illegal American invaders came, California was an independent nation, independent from Mexico. What they're talking about specifically was February 22nd. I'm sorry, let's start with November 3rd, 1836. November 3rd, 1836, Mexico sent a governor called Gutierrez to California to basically run it. Californians from the north and the south went out to meet General Gutierrez in November 3rd, 1836, and defeated him in battle in Monterey. So Mexico sent a governor. The Californios met him in battle and said, "You're not running this place, get out." 1836. Mexico again sent a governor in 1845 called Michel Torena. That's Michel Torena. In February 22nd, 1845, Californios again went out to meet this Mexican governor and said, "You're not welcome," and go away. That was at Studio City. So you have 1836, 1845, a 10-year period where Mexico keeps sending governors, Gutierrez and then Michel Torena, and then people from California push them back, basically declaring independence. The rightful government sends its authority figure here, and the people here with guns say, "Get lost." That's called an independence movement whenever you look around the planet. Just saying. So, here's the interesting thing. The same people who marched out in 1836, November 3rd, and in February 22nd, 1845, to make California independent from Mexico, were also the same people who were pushing the secularization of the missions in California in 1831. Spain was kicked out. Mexico took over the territory. In California, there were people saying, "Hey, let's take all the mission land, kick the indigenous off of it, not give it back to them, and keep it for ourselves." It's pretty horrible. But there were also Californios who said, "That's racist. Those people had a genocide against them. The least that we can do is return all mission land back to California indigenous." And here's the interesting thing. Those Californios that wanted all land returned to the indigenous were the Californios who fought to kick off Mexico in 1836 and 1845. Same group. The Californios that did not go out in 1836 and 1845 to kick out Mexican authority were the same Californios who said, "Let's not give land to the indigenous and keep it for ourselves." The Californios who fought for independence over 10 years and fought for indigenous rights were known as Juan Batista Alvarado from from Los Angeles. Alvarado Street in LA is named after him. And Jose Castro from San Jose. Yes, the Castro district in San Francisco is named after him, and Alvarado Street in Los Angeles. So Juan Alvarado and Jose Castro. Jose and Juan went out there in 1836 and said, "Get out of here, Mexico." Jose and Juan went back out there. 1845 said, "Get out of here, Mexico." And it was Jose and Juan who were arrested by the authorities because they wanted indigenous people to have their land back. So if you talk about the California period, and you're saying that there were some Californios who did not respect the indigenous, you're right. But the ones that wanted independence were fighting for the indigenous. Let's get that straight. California was independent 1836 to 1846, and they were the good guys. Illegal American invaders came 1846, shot them, threatened them, overthrew their rights, took away voting rights, disenfranchised black people, introduced segregation, and started a genocide against the indigenous. The indigenous had never seen an actual intentional genocide. The Mission Indian period was a slow genocide. It absolutely was a genocide. But it was a genocide over time, where the missions grew and they'd grab people as they needed them. Horrible, wrong, evil, wicked. But when the Americans came in 1846, they said, let's kill all of the indigenous off right away. Nobody had ever been that thorough. You would not see that level of orchestrated genocide until a man called Adolf Hitler. That's right. The Americans who came illegally invaded the country, brought in the army, brought in the navy, disenfranchised the people, started a genocide that in its execution and intention and deliberation was only paralleled by the Nazi Holocaust. I'm not exaggerating. Look it up. So when you celebrate June 14th, 1846, you're celebrating an invasion for white supremacists, by white supremacists, that created a Jim Crow apartheid state and caused the genocide. June 14th, 1846. That's what you're celebrating. In response to that, I would suggest something that I've seen from the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors are from California. When the Black Lives Matter movement started, I think it was Cullors, put out a message on social media saying she wanted to start this movement. The only other person in all of America who initially responded was Alicia Garza. So a Californian says, let's start a movement called Black Lives Matter or something like that. Sends it to everybody in America. The only other person in all of America who ever picks up on that is another Californian. Look it up. Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Californians started the Black Lives Matter movement here. Now they added Oprah Tometi, but that was after, and she was out of New York. She came when they started adding to expand and get an immigrant base. That idea was born here by people from here exclusively. So it is in homage and inspiration and frankly a little bit of jealousy. Cullors, I've been watching your career. I'm jealous. I just am. I saw you, Cullors, go to Derry, and I saw you go to the West Bank. Wow, I was impressed. I also saw your book, How They Call You a Terrorist. Welcome to the club. I know how that feels. Anyways, taking a method from the Black Lives Matter movement, a thoroughly California-born and orchestrated movement, I would like to propose that California defund the United States military in California. So, yes, California today, in honor of June 14th, 1846, would like to propose to the governor of California, the legislature, and everybody who cares and considers themselves a true California nationalist, that we defund the United States military in California. Now, sounds radical. How do you go about doing that without causing chaos? As you know, we're about peaceful, legal, orderly, negotiated independence. And this can be done. There is something called the California National Guard. Now, no, it's not the official Army, Navy, military, Marines, etc. That'll be another step. But when you look at the most and many of the forces here in California that Californians rely on, it's the California National Guard, 22,000 people, roughly. We could defund the California portion of the California National Guard and transfer all of the money to the California State Guard. I'll get to why you'd want to do that in a second. Well, actually, let's jump ahead. I was very unsure exactly how to present this argument because there's a lot of figures behind it, but I'll just go like this. There are two reserves. So you have active military, they're on the coast, they go to Iraq and invade countries and blow up foreign people and do all sorts of American imperialism. And then you have kind of a National Guard, or the reserves as they're called, and they kind of stay back here. Therefore, chaos and riots and forest fires and earthquakes and things like that. Well, that's split up into two groups, the California National Guard and the California State Guard. National Guard is owned by the federal government and can be taken over by the federal government at any time. California State Guard cannot be federalized and cannot be taken over by the federal government. In fact, the California State Guard was invented in 1941 because the California National Guard was activated to fight World War II in Japan. And so all of the National Guard left, and the California government was going, wow, we have no militia or military here for anything, if anything goes wrong. We need a military force that we control and can't be sent out. California State Guard. So it was designed from day one to be a federal government doesn't control this and can send it out. And that's important because in 2004, the California National Guard was federalized. Now in 2006, 2007, 2008, you had forest fires throughout California. Governor Schwarzenegger, a Republican, ended his friendship with Republican George W. Bush because George W. Bush started the war in Iraq, federalized California National Guard. They were all sent to Iraq, and then we had forest fires, and our forests burned down. Governor Schwarzenegger begged the federal government for assistance. He got nothing. Californians had to spend tax money from California, although we're a donor state and we're already putting into the federal system, we had to go back into our budget, raise taxes on ourselves or deferred funding to pay neighboring states for firefighting assistance because we didn't have the National Guard because it was sent out. So California State Guard was built so you can't federalize it and send it out. And in 2006, 7, and 8, we saw literally why you would do that. And we got literally hurt. People were dead. Property was destroyed. The economy was hurt. People were scared because we couldn't rely on the National Guard. But it gets worse. The U.S. Commission on National Security before 9/11 said that terrorist forces and others who harm Americans are most likely to attack domestically in America when the National Guard is deployed because they know if they cause chaos, there won't be anybody to respond. America causes a war. It sends out the National Guard to go fight that war. We don't have those people here for an emergency. And the U.S. Commission on National Security before 9/11 said, whenever anyone outside the world sees the National Guard deployed, they think time to attack soft targets because they can cause chaos and you can't respond. So when the National Guard is sent off, we can't protect ourselves and we're even more vulnerable, according to the national government. Wow, that's dumb. But it gets even worse. The National Guard will not do Homeland Security training for this reason. The National Guard has to be ready to be federally deployed. Because over half of the money for the National Guard here in California comes from the federal government, they have to meet those rules. The rules say you want federal money for the California National Guard, you have to be ready to be deployed overseas. You're not ready to be deployed overseas, you don't get federal money. So if you want federal money, which is over half the budget, you have to be ready to act like an invasion army, which means they will not train for domestic peacekeeping. I'm not making this up. The National Guard will not take on a Homeland Security role. Homeland Security asked them, they said no, because of money. So they cannot take on a protecting us role. They can be deployed when we need them. When they are deployed, we're even more likely to be attacked. And even if we could keep them, they won't do the training to bother to protect us. I'm not making this up. Additionally, in 2011, the Obama administration revised Regulation 10-4 of the National Guard, saying Federal National Guard will not provide any assistance or equipment to the California State Guard. So, the National Guard will not help the California State Guard or give them any equipment. That was a rule change because of Obama in 2011. But we're a donor state and we pay more in, but we can't even get the National Guard to help our home force. Okay. Also, COVID-19 emergency in 2020. The National Guard was deployed by the federal government to help in the COVID-19 emergency. And Californians loved that. But then the federal government said, yeah, we're going to cut funding to it. And California said, well, the COVID-19 emergency is still going on. And the federal government said, I don't think it is. So I'm just going to cut your National Guard funding. Deal with it, California. So even when you do get the National Guard, they can just be not only redeployed, but have their funding cut and not even help us. Let alone they won't even train for the job to provide security when we need it. And to make it really awesome, 2016, the California National Guard was said to have the rule of law ceased and be nothing more than a criminal syndicate. I'm not making that up. Look up California National Guard, criminal syndicate, criminal syndicate. The last two directors of the California National Guard are under investigation for embezzling. Last two. It's pretty bad. So here's what I suggest we do. The California National Guard gets about $124 million from the federal government. It gets $100 million from California, and it has about 22,000 people. The California State Guard, which can't be federalized, and we can direct to do whatever we want, hold whatever we want, and will always be here when we need them, and nobody can screw with that, receives a budget in 2012 of about $640,000. That's probably adjusted for inflation. California State Guard probably makes under $1 million annually. So California State Guard, less than $1 million. California National Guard, $100 million from California, in addition to $124 million from the federal government. California State Guard, 1,400 people. California National Guard, 22,000. So, legal scholar Adam Freedman in 2016, in an article called The Militia You Never Heard Of, that's legal scholar Adam Freedman, international legal scholar, 2016, Militia You Never Heard Of, said there's no federal law that says you have to fund the National Guard. There's no federal law that says you have to fund the National Guard. So if the California government decided to redirect all of its National Guard funding to the State Guard, it could do that and no one can stop them at all. It just hasn't ever thought of that, but there's no reason it can't. This legal scholar points that out in 2016. California could redirect $100 million from the California National Guard to the California State Guard, expanding its budget 100 times and redirecting everybody to work there. So they could get 22 times the amount of labor and 100 times the amount of funding within 1 year, if you choose to make it happen. So, June 14th, 1846, illegal immigrants came in, invaded, overthrew the government, set up a white supremacist apartheid government that enacted genocide and Jim Crow laws, which had never existed before. And that's what you're celebrating on June 14th, 1846. Well, yes, California wants to propose a different solution. We celebrate June 14th, 1846 as the day that we announced California will actively seek to defund the United States military in California. We will first start by redirecting all California funding for the California National Guard to the California State Guard. That should really put a cross over the bow and let people know your days of being an imperial order bent on white supremacy and the fact that you get to have control over us because of that disgusting legacy is over. And we will make gigantic, symbolic, and real policy shifts to rub that in your face.